you're a bit different than most of the candidates we get. You're pretty talented, qualified. I saw the presentation. You're pretty good. So why are you leaving Price? I'm sure Price gave you an offer. Why are you joining IBM? Everything was ready. Said, well, blah, blah, blah. I gave my answer, and he was like, okay. Then he started drilling me again. And what's actually crazy was in the final round. So one of the industries I worked in, I was at PwC, was paper and pulp. So paper and pulp, for those who don't get more context, it's basically a factory where you make paper, printing paper,
right.
things like that.
Yeah, here in Wisconsin, we have a ton of paper mills, that
right.
smash pulp into sheets.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you're familiar, right?
Totally.
Unfortunately for me, that was an internship, right? So I knew a bit about paper and
pulp.
I was talking to the lead executive of paper and pulp in Canada. Like the guy in front of me was guy. I just got really unlucky. That's how unlucky I got in this interview. And he was like, "Oh, it's great that you worked at paper and pulp." He knew the client, right? Even if I couldn't even say the client, he probably knew who it was without even flinching. He was like, "Walk me through the entire paper and pulp process." None of my friends prepared me for that question.
Yeah.
Right? I was just like, crap. Obviously, I did well and I did okay. So what's the lesson here? And the reason I'm being transparent here, because I got the job, right? The reason I'm being transparent here, because, he loves me. We're great friends now. He's just really hard for the interview. But he's awesome. I love that guy. But there's a point that I'm driving is you always need to prepare for everything. But the only way to prepare for everything, especially in the context that you mentioned, asking questions, there are definitely questions you won't know the answer to. So the best way to prepare is by getting your friends to ask you every question in the box. Rob, what's your greatest weakness? Why do you want to work here anyways? What do you think are missions and values and how they tie into who you are? Blah, 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 on and on and on. Hours a day, constantly. So when you're in that interview, they can ask you anything. It doesn't matter. Same example I'll give again. This very podcast, when I was on my first podcast interview, you can imagine my reaction. Why is a stranger asking me questions about my life? I don't know. Why are you asking me these questions? Which is obviously not your case. I know you're an amazing interviewer. But then after 100 shows, I kind of just said, well, at the end of the day, what's Rob going to ask me that I don't already have an answer to? Because I've just answered it over and over again. But that analogy applies to you in an interview, right? If you've already answered everything, if you're telling me about yourself, you can't be somebody else. You know the answer, then you'll be pitch perfect.
Got it. Good deal. So again, another little summary bullet points there. If you've got 3 or 4 people in front of you, be prepared to answer almost anything. And again, train up with the people who are in your life that can help you. But when you have them sitting in front of you in that spread, if you will, acknowledge the question, buy yourself some time, and then acknowledge folks in turn across the span, if you will. There was one other thing that you mentioned. Defaulting to your lowest level of training. That's actually something that I've always had in my kind of brain here for the past number of years, because it happens whenever you have an adrenaline dump. And from my past industry, in the firearms industry, we talk about self-defense. And when you actually, would have to use a firearm against another human being, that is an adrenaline dump because you're in a deadly force situation and you default to your lowest level of training. So if you don't practice, if you don't run the mind games, whether it's jobs or hopefully not a home invasion or something like that, you always default to the lowest. So the goal for a job seeker is to raise that floor. This job that you have, Brenden, I knowing everything about what the application process is, I'm looking at this going, I don't think I'd ever apply for this. Like this just sounds awful, but it sounds like you really enjoy what you do. Number one. Number two, it sounds like it's very rewarding for you. So, we talked a lot about answering those questions, and we're asked a lot of behavioral questions in interviews, and I'm sure you were asked plenty of those. A few weeks ago on the show here, we covered the STAR method, which is situation, task, action, result, when you're asked a question like that. What can you teach us, Brenden, today about creating an effective story for an interview question like that?
Right. So I don't want to kind of double what the other person did. So I completely agree. Let me start by saying STAR is the best way of going through any question.
Okay, cool.
But what I will say is most people use STAR in the wrong way. So in the sense of they explain a situation, a task, an action, a result, but they do it in a way that they don't seem passionate at all. Yeah, so this is the situation. I was at work at a Fortune 500 company. The biggest mistake people make with STAR is that they don't look like they're living the story. So what I always recommend people to do is you only tell your best stuff in an interview. And nobody does that because they kind of just say, oh, well, I guess I need 2-3 star things. I'll figure it out. But they don't really ask themselves, what are the best stories in my box? One thing that they do at McKinsey & Company, which is one of the hardest companies in the world to get into, I think the rate is 1 in 400 get a job at the company. It's pretty nuts.
Wow,
pretty
that's crazy. And that's of the people that get an interview.
Oh, yeah.
So there might be 4,000 more that don't even get in the door.
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy.
Absolutely. I'm one of those people who didn't even get an interview. And I'm like the crazy guy here.
Right, yes.
Right? So the point I'm driving with Mac is what they do that's really interesting is their interviewers are trained for the best stories because there's so many good applicants that are in this pool.
Sure.
And that like we're talking gold medalists in like the Olympics apply for like a job at McKinsey. We're talking, I know a couple of guys at McKinsey, but like not Olympic gold medalists, but they've done some really fascinating stuff with their life. So the key is when you talk about star in your jobs that you're currently competing for and that you want in your life, you want to figure out how can you star to pull out some of the most interesting stories within your repertoire. So one thing, an exercise I do with my friends that they did on me is out of everything in your life, Brenden, the case competitions, blah, blah, blah. What are the 2 to 3 stories that like would blow people's minds?
Okay.
So one of them, I won't expand too much, but I'll just name them really quickly. So one of them obviously is the YouTube channel. So I started the YouTube thing in university. So that's obviously very unique. Oh, like this guy's like adding values, creating thought leadership. That's cool. That's unique. Number 2, he coached a lot of people on leadership, public speaking at a very young age. So I trained, dozens of people on public speaking. I talked about that experience, how I managed the teams. So it's really good because it shows leadership in what you're doing. And I was explaining the hardest moment in my life, which was when one of those competitions got canceled. So we put in a bunch of work in. And then we found out the day before that it wasn't happening anymore. So everyone was crying, and I had to do crisis management at the age of like 21. So you can imagine the way you're reacting to me right now. You know how differentiated I am as a candidate right now? Because you're watching me, and you're like, wow, this guy's like incredible. I need to give this person a job. Whereas the 7 people I interviewed today, this was their story. Yeah, so I was at work, Rob, and so I printed some paper, and that's the result, man. We got some printed paper. You're just like, right?
Right. You zone out of a non-interesting story.
Exactly.
So bring your A game. Got it.
And this is going to be great reassurance for people. The people who are the best in the game right now in this market already have a job. You're not competing against people like we, right? We have a job with the top performers in our companies right now. So we're not getting far, trust me. But the point that I'm driving for you who's listening is that's your advantage. If you do what I'm saying right now, how many candidates are actually doing this? Like interesting stories getting pushed on by their friends to see. No, Rob. Because remember, one thing I want to push here, because I'm getting really excited this discussion. Your friends are much better at pulling out stories about you than you are. Let me repeat that again. Everyone else besides you is better at pulling out your best qualities than you. So when I started practicing this, it sounded something like this. My name's Brenden. This is coming from the speech coach guy. I'm Brenden, and I worked at PwC, and I won a job at IBM. Thank you. Then my friends look at me, and he's like, I've spent 3 years competing with you. You're one of the brightest minds I've ever worked with, and you don't sound like anything that you usually are. Step up your game. And I just said, okay, but I don't want to talk about this, Rich. I don't want to do that. It's like, you're going to do that if you want the job. You need that accountability. You need someone to tell you what your great qualities are so you can bring them out in a very eloquent way that I've done a couple minutes ago.
Yeah, and that's outstanding. And you mentioned a great point there, too, about, yes, the creme de la creme. You are a smart person. That's why you're on this show. You are a smart person, and you're a gifted person. I can tell that. I can tell that from the moment that you and I connected through the guesting platform that I use. I can tell well, this guy's really got his stuff together. And I may not be as bright as you, but because you have a position, I don't have to worry about you. You're not my competition, which is awesome. So it doesn't matter what somebody's level of intelligence or anything is. It kind of comes down to hard work in this case. And somebody who is looking for that position needs to take on the qualities that you have that landed you IBM and things like that in order to land anything from a middle management job down to, I almost think this is applicable to entry level positions in, jobs that people would tend to not find glamorous, fast food, things along those lines. So if you can differentiate yourself by being the best candidate, things will start to flow your way, which is great. Good deal. Alrighty. I think I'm gonna. Yeah, I do want to ask this one now that I really. We've been talking about this, so I know that I'm a person who is talky, if you will, and I think you and I probably sort of share that together. This is a show with two talkers talking to each other. In an interview, we want to be succinct. We want to be very compact, but hit really hard with the words that we use. Are there times when you should be a bit more verbose?
So one thing I'll emphasize is there's an easy way to figure that out. It really depends on the company. If you're applying to Louis Vuitton, right, which is a very high luxury brand, maybe the language that they use is going to be very different. So my advice is actually really simple.
But it's going to be French too. It's going to be French because Louis Vuitton.
Oh, right. Yeah, I do. I brought out my little French.
The actual words you use. Go ahead, Brenden. Sorry.
Yeah. No. It's all good. It's all good. But the point LVMH essentially. But the point I'm driving is any company you're serious about, you want to make sure you're talking to somebody in the department. I don't care if you're applying for a sales job. I don't care if you're applying for a secretary job. Doesn't matter. You need to get to know one person on the team, even if you're cold emailing them. I cold emailed a bunch of people when I applied for the different consulting because I hit all those firms, McKinsey, Bain, all those companies.
Sure.
But the reason you want to do that is so you understand the language in which they operate. So I'll give an example. McKinsey is a good mix of professionalism and casual. So they know how to act professional, but they're a bit more casual with their coffees. BCG is super casual at the Montreal office. They're super easygoing, incredibly hardworking though. IBM is so casual. But as a point that I'm driving is by understanding the language and how they speak, you know how to speak in an interview. In most cases, at least in the city where I applied for jobs, most people are super casual. If you use very complex words, they'll actually like you less for it. So I think the point that you want to drive is mirror the language of the other person that you want to interview for. You basically want to convince them in an interview that you're one of them. That's why my number one tip with interview actually has nothing to do with public speaking. It's get the job before you even interview for it. So that means that when you walk in for your interview, the interview should already know you and like you, because somebody that either referred you or somebody you got a coffee with said, hey, by the way, this Brenden guy, he's really interesting. I had a chat with him for 30 minutes last week. I think he's going to be a good fit for the team. So they're both going to say, oh, well, Brendan's already a good fit for the team. And then I come there and just validate what they already thought was true.
Got it. And I'm so glad you actually went into that, because I was going to ask you exactly that. What should I be picking up to take with me to that one-on-one interview, and finding out, you're already one of us is probably the biggest thing. And if I can add a bit of my expertise on that, I think you have a very short amount of time, and you'll have done some research and things like that, but you have a very short amount of time to adjust yourself to being one of them, because maybe you've met somebody through an email, and that doesn't necessarily tell you how they speak, or through LinkedIn, whatever it might be. So you have to be very perceptive in that first meeting with somebody to be like, okay, I have to match energy, I have to match posture, I have to match things that are their body language, maybe their level of education, things along those lines. You have a very, very short window to do that initially, but as you're taken through the interview, you can actually adjust that kind of on the fly, which is really, really neat. And you should evolve that persona as well. So really, really great stuff there, Brenden. So I think we're down. Actually, that I was going to ask you, what's the biggest guiding rule for interviewing when it comes to talking? I think you did just slam it home there, which is really interesting. Let me go to this kind of next question. It kind of talks about the same thing. And it's one of my favorite comedians, this guy by the name of Eddie Izzard. Have you heard of him?
But I'm a huge fan of stand-up, though.
Okay, very good. Well, Eddie is a cross-dresser, and he's British. And he does some TV and some movies, too. I think he was in Peaky Blinders for half a minute or something like that. But in one of his comedy bits, it's an older one, he talks about America's national anthem and how we always look so proud of what we're singing, even though some of us don't know the words. And he makes a big show out of singing the Star Spangled Banner in absolute gibberish. But at the end of the bit, he mentions the following, which is 50% of what you say is how you look when you say it, 40% is how you sound, and 10% is what you actually say. Now, that was terrible British accent. Maybe people will get letters about that. In a job and hiring environment, is that the same? That 50% of looking the part, 40% of sounding the part, and 10% is actually just the words coming out of your mouth.
Right. I wouldn't worry too much about the stats. That's why I tend to avoid it.
Well,